Maria pushed the heavy cleaning cart down the quiet hallway, her footsteps soft against the polished floor. It was almost 9 at night, and the office building was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. Most of the employees had left hours ago, hurrying home to their families, dinners, or television shows. For Maria, though, her work was only just beginning. She had been a janitor in the building for almost 6 years. Every evening, she clocked in, changed into her faded uniform, and started her route. Most nights followed the same rhythm: empty the trash cans, wipe the desks, polish the glass doors, and mop the long hallways that always seemed endless. It was work many people never thought about, but Maria carried it out with quiet pride. She told herself that cleanliness mattered. If she didn't do her job, the workers wouldn't be able to sit at clean desks, and the clients wouldn't be impressed by spotless meeting rooms. That evening, as she reached the boardroom, Maria paused for a moment, pushing open the tall wooden door. The room was larger than any other in the building, with a long polished table in the center and tall windows that looked out over the city lights. She had always thought of it as the heart of the company, where important decisions were made, and powerful voices filled the air. To her, it felt like a world far away from her own, yet it was also her responsibility to keep it shining. Tonight, though, the boardroom looked unusually messy. Empty coffee cups stood forgotten at one end of the table. Wrinkled napkins and crumpled papers lay scattered across the surface. Someone had dropped a pen that rolled onto the floor, and near the far corner, Maria noticed a dark sticky spot where a soda had spilled and dried into the carpet. She sighed softly. It would take extra time to clean this room, and she still had other areas left on her list. But Maria didn't complain. She never did. She put on her gloves, filled the bucket with fresh water, and began. First, she picked up the papers and cups, stacking them neatly to throw away. Then she sprayed the table with cleaner and started wiping it down. The wood gleamed faintly in the dim light, though streaks of fingerprints still remained. Maria leaned into her work, moving slowly but steadily. As she worked, her thoughts drifted. Cleaning late at night gave her plenty of time to think. Sometimes she thought of her children, now grown and living on their own. Sometimes she thought of her small apartment across town, where her favorite chair and a warm blanket waited for her. And sometimes, she thought of the past when she first started this job, nervous and unsure, wondering if anyone would even notice her efforts. 6 years later, she had her answer: most people didn't notice. But Maria had made peace with that. She wasn't doing this for recognition. She was doing it for herself, for the paycheck that kept her bills paid, and for the quiet satisfaction of seeing a room transform from messy to spotless under her hands. Still, there were moments when she wished people would see more than just a janitor. She wished someone would understand the patience it took to polish a glass wall until it looked invisible, or the strength it required to push a heavy mop bucket down long hallways, night after night. She wasn't bitter, no, that wasn't Maria's way. But deep down, she sometimes wondered if her efforts mattered to anyone else at all. She set the mop into the bucket and wrung it out, then began working on the sticky patch on the floor. The sound of the mop swishing echoed in the empty boardroom. It was the kind of sound that reminded her of her childhood, when her mother used to scrub floors in their little house. Maria smiled faintly at the memory. Perhaps it ran in the family, the sense of duty, this habit of cleaning not just for others but for one's own dignity. As she bent to scrub a stubborn spot, Maria didn't notice at first that someone had entered the room. The door creaked softly, and footsteps crossed the carpet. Startled, she looked up. For a moment, her heart jumped. It was unusual for anyone to still be in the building this late. Most nights, she worked entirely alone. A man stood near the window, his back turned to her. He was tall, dressed in a simple white shirt with the sleeves rolled up. He didn't look like the other executives Maria sometimes glimpsed during the day. There was no suit jacket, no polished shoes. Instead, he looked almost casual, his tie loosened as if he had been working too long. Maria hesitated. She wondered if he had forgotten something in the boardroom. It wasn't her place to ask questions, so she quietly returned to mopping, trying not to disturb him. Yet the presence of another person in the otherwise empty building felt unusual. She stole quick glances at him as she worked. He wasn't looking at her, instead, he stared out of the tall window at the city, as though lost in thought. The silence between them stretched. Maria focused on the floor, dipping the mop into the bucket again. But after a few minutes, the man turned around and gave her a small, polite smile. "Long night, huh?" he said softly. Maria blinked, a little surprised. It wasn't often that anyone spoke to her while she was working. Usually, people passed by quickly, maybe nodding, but rarely stopping for conversation. She nodded back, her voice quiet. "Yes, it always takes a little longer when the boardroom is used." The man chuckled faintly, his voice warm but tired. "I suppose we did leave quite a mess in here." Maria wasn't sure what to say to that. She gave a small shrug, unwilling to complain but not wanting to dismiss his words either. "It's part of the job," she replied simply. For a while, he said nothing more, and Maria assumed he would leave soon. She continued scrubbing, her mind returning to her own thoughts. But then, to her surprise, the man stepped closer to the table, picked up a cloth from the side of her cart, and began wiping down the surface. Maria froze. She almost thought she was imagining it. No one had ever done that before, not in all her years of working here. Executives, interns, even receptionists, none had ever so much as lifted a cloth. She stared at him in confusion. "You don't have to do that," she said quickly, her cheeks flushing. "It's my work. I'll take care of it." But the man only smiled again, this time with a hint of playfulness. "Well, I was part of the group that made the mess. I think it's only fair I help clean it up." Maria didn't know how to respond. She felt awkward, unsure whether to insist he stop or let him continue. But something in his manner, so casual, so unbothered, made it hard to protest further. So she bent down again, continuing to mop while he wiped the table beside her. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. In fact, it felt strangely natural, as though they had done this before. Maria found herself working a little slower than usual, listening to the quiet rhythm of the cloth against the wood and the mop across the floor. She didn't know who he was, not yet. To her, he was just another worker in the building, maybe someone new, maybe someone stuck working late. She had no reason to suspect otherwise. All she knew was that, for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel quite so invisible. Maria kept her eyes on the mop, though she couldn't help glancing at the man now and then. He seemed comfortable wiping the table, not awkward at all, as if this was something he had done many times before. His movements were slow but careful, not rushed, and he worked with the same quiet patience she used when cleaning. Most people who passed through this building walked with hurried steps, their eyes fixed on their phones, their minds full of meetings, schedules, and deadlines. But this man seemed different. He wasn't rushing anywhere. He wasn't distracted. He looked fully present, as though this moment cleaning a messy boardroom late at night was the only thing that mattered. Maria felt a small tug of curiosity. Who was he? She had never seen him before. She knew almost all the workers by face, if not by name. Every evening, as people left the building, she would notice them, some leaving cheerfully, some tired, some too busy to even nod in her direction. But this man didn't match any face she could recall. He looked new, perhaps recently hired. She guessed he might be an assistant or an intern. His simple shirt and rolled-up sleeves gave him a modest look, far from the polished suits that most executives wore. His loosened tie and slightly rumpled hair made him look even younger, though there was something in his eyes, a steadiness, a depth that made her wonder if he wasn't as young as she thought. Maria cleared her throat lightly. "Are you working late?" she asked, her voice unsure. The man glanced at her, then smiled faintly. "Something like that," he said. "I stayed back after the meeting. Thought I'd get a few things done." She nodded. That made sense. Meetings in the boardroom often stretched for hours. She had seen employees walk out late at night, their faces heavy with exhaustion. Sometimes they left papers scattered everywhere, sometimes half-finished meals, and she always cleaned up silently after them. Still, it was unusual for anyone to remain behind once the meeting ended. Most people couldn't wait to escape. But here he was, standing calmly in the middle of the mess, not rushing out the door. For a few minutes, they worked side by side in silence. Maria scrubbed the floor where the soda had left a sticky mark, while he wiped circles across the table, polishing it until the wood reflected the dim lights overhead. The rhythm of cleaning filled the room, the splash of water in the bucket, the soft squeak of the mop, the quiet swish of the cloth against wood. Finally, Maria spoke again. "You don't really have to help. I'll finish everything. It's my job." The man paused, resting the cloth in his hand. "I know," he said gently. "But it doesn't feel right to just stand here while you do all the work. Besides," he gave a small shrug, his lips curving into a smile. "It's nice to do something simple after a long day." Maria didn't know what to say to that. His words carried a kind of honesty that surprised her. Most people, when they noticed her, either ignored her completely or gave her polite but distant smiles. Rarely did anyone speak in such a way as though her presence mattered, as though her work wasn't invisible. She felt her cheeks grow warm, though she quickly bent her head to hide it. "Well, thank you," she murmured, almost shyly. The man only nodded, continuing his task without another word. For Maria, the moment felt almost unreal. Here she was, a janitor in her worn uniform, and yet a stranger, a man she thought was just starting his career, was helping her mop the floor of the grand boardroom. The contrast struck her deeply. She had grown used to invisibility, used to the way people rushed past her as though she were part of the furniture. Yet tonight, someone had stopped, noticed, and chosen to share the weight of her work, even for a short while. As she scrubbed, Maria found herself talking more, her words slipping out softly, almost against her own cautious nature. "I've been cleaning this building for a long time," she said, as though explaining herself. "Every night, I see the papers, the coffee, the crumbs from sandwiches, everything people leave behind. It's like the story of the day is written on these tables and floors." The man glanced at her, his eyes thoughtful. "That's an interesting way to see it," he said. "Most people wouldn't think about it that way." Maria gave a faint smile. "Maybe not. But I notice things others don't." She hesitated, then added, "When you work in silence, you see details. You see who leaves their things messy, who takes care to keep their space neat. You see the tiredness in the cups of coffee at midnight meetings, and the excitement in the piles of papers when big projects begin." Her words surprised even herself. She didn't usually speak like this to strangers. But there was something about his calm presence that encouraged her. He nodded slowly, as though her words carried weight. "It sounds like you've learned a lot just by watching." Maria chuckled softly, shaking her head. "Maybe. Or maybe I've just learned how much people leave behind for someone else to clean." They both laughed quietly, the sound echoing in the empty room. It was a small, genuine laugh, the kind Maria rarely shared with people at work. As the minutes passed, Maria felt more at ease. She asked him a few questions, small ones, nothing too personal. Did he work in the building? Was he new? He answered with simple replies, never giving too much detail, yet never sounding dismissive either. His tone was friendly, his manner humble. She learned that he had indeed been away for a while and had only just returned recently. She assumed that meant he was new to the company, perhaps on probation or training. His modest appearance and willingness to help supported her guess. In her mind, he was just another young employee trying to find his place in the company. What she didn't know and couldn't possibly guess was the truth. The man beside her wasn't an intern, or an assistant, or a junior staff member. He was the one person in the company who held more power than anyone else. He was the CEO, the leader of every person whose footsteps echoed in these halls during the day. But to Maria, at that moment, he was simply a kind stranger who had chosen to share her burden for no reason other than humanity. That night, as they worked together, Maria felt a rare sense of companionship. It wasn't dramatic or grand, it was simple, quiet, and strangely comforting. She realized she didn't feel so alone. The long hours of cleaning, usually filled only with her thoughts and the hum of machines, were now softened by conversation, by laughter, by the presence of someone who treated her not as invisible but as an equal. By the time the boardroom began to shine again, the sticky patches gone and the table gleaming under the lights, Maria felt lighter. Her arms still ached from scrubbing, and her back was tired, but her heart carried something new, a small spark of gratitude, a reminder that kindness could come from unexpected places. She still didn't know who he was. She still thought of him as the new guy. But in her mind, he had already stood out from the hundreds of faces she had seen in the building. And though she couldn't explain why, she sensed that this simple night of cleaning together would remain with her long after the floors dried and the lights went out. Maria felt her arms growing tired, but she didn't want to stop. Something about working side by side with this man made the room feel less heavy, less lonely. The mop slid across the floor in steady strokes, while he moved slowly around the table, polishing one section at a time. It was quiet work, yet it no longer felt like the silence she had grown used to. Instead, it felt shared, as if the two of them were carrying the weight of the room together. At one point, she set the mop aside and bent down to scrub a stubborn mark on the carpet. The man crouched next to her, holding out the cloth he had been using. "Here, let me try," he said, his voice light but sincere. Maria shook her head quickly. "No, no, it's fine. This is what I do." He smiled, but didn't move away. "That doesn't mean I can't help." And before she could protest again, he dabbed the cloth against the stain, pressing firmly until the dark spot began to fade. Maria watched in silence, almost amused. He didn't seem bothered at all by the thought of kneeling on the floor, by the mess, or by the fact that the task didn't match his position in the company. Most men in crisp shirts avoided even touching the trash cans, but here he was, crouching like it was the most natural thing in the world. She gave a small laugh, surprising herself. "You're not very good at this," she teased, pointing to the way he rubbed too roughly, leaving streaks on the carpet. He laughed too, shaking his head. "I never claimed I was an expert. You're the professional here." The word professional made her pause. No one had ever called her that before. People said cleaning lady or janitor, or sometimes didn't call her anything at all. But he had said it as if her work carried skill and value. It warmed her heart in a way she couldn't explain. As the stain lightened, he sat back on his heels, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. "There," he said with mock pride. "Not bad, right?" Maria rolled her eyes, though she couldn't hide her smile. "Not bad for someone new," she admitted. "But if you did this every night, you'd understand it takes patience, not force." "Then maybe you should teach me," he said lightly, as if the idea didn't sound strange at all. Maria didn't know how to reply. The thought of teaching someone like him how to clean felt almost laughable, yet his tone was so genuine that she couldn't dismiss it. She shook her head, still smiling, and returned to her mop. They continued working, falling into a rhythm again. Maria noticed that he didn't rush to leave, even though he could have. Many nights, Employees walked past her as if she were invisible, eager to head home. But this man stayed, moving cloth over wood, adjusting chairs, even gathering empty cups to throw away. He didn't treat any of it as beneath him. The more they worked together, the more Maria felt her guard slowly lowering. She found herself telling him small pieces of her life. She mentioned how she had 2 children, both grown now, who rarely needed her help anymore but still called her every weekend. She spoke about her love for plants, how her small apartment balcony was filled with potted flowers and herbs. She even admitted how some nights, when the building was especially quiet, she liked to hum songs to herself while she cleaned, just to make the silence less heavy. He listened carefully, never interrupting. Sometimes he asked gentle questions, not out of politeness but out of real curiosity. "What kind of flowers?" he asked when she spoke about her balcony garden. "Do your children live far?" he asked when she mentioned her family. His questions weren't grand or dramatic, but they carried interest, and Maria felt seen in a way she hadn't in a long time. In return, he shared small details of his own life. He said he traveled often, though he didn't explain why. He admitted he missed home-cooked meals and rarely had time to sit quietly and enjoy simple things. He joked about not knowing how to cook anything beyond instant noodles. His stories were vague, but Maria didn't notice the missing details. To her, it sounded like the voice of a young man still finding his balance in life. There was one moment when Maria, out of habit, bent to lift the heavy mop bucket. It was half filled with water, and her arms strained as she dragged it a few feet across the floor. Before she could pull it further, he stepped forward and took it from her hands. "I'll carry it," he said firmly. Maria frowned. "No, it's heavy. You'll hurt yourself." He chuckled. "You've been carrying it all this time. I think I'll survive." And with ease, he lifted the bucket and placed it closer to where she was mopping. Maria stood there, speechless for a moment. No one had ever done that for her in this building. People walked past her struggling with bags of trash or buckets of water, never pausing to offer help. Yet this man, whom she thought was just a new employee, had noticed without being asked. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice softer than before. He only nodded, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The boardroom slowly transformed under their hands. The floor grew shiny, the table gleamed, and the chairs were set neatly around it. Even the air felt fresher, free from the smell of spilled soda and stale coffee. Maria stepped back at one point, looking around with quiet satisfaction. She had always loved the moment when a room went from chaos to calm, when her hard work revealed itself in shining surfaces and clean order. This time, though, she wasn't admiring it alone. The man stood beside her, also looking at the room with a small smile. "Looks good," he said simply. Maria nodded. "It always does, in the end." There was a pause then, not uncomfortable but filled with a kind of unspoken understanding. Maria felt that strange spark again, the feeling that she wasn't invisible anymore, at least not to him. She realized that this night would stay in her memory, no matter what. Not because of the room, not even because of the work, but because someone had chosen to share it with her. Someone who didn't treat her as just a janitor, but as a fellow human being whose time and effort mattered. As she picked up her cart and prepared to leave the boardroom, Maria felt lighter than she had in years. Her body was still tired, but her heart carried something new, an unexpected warmth that reminded her of kindness, of dignity, of the strange ways people's paths could cross. To her, he was still just the new guy. She didn't know his name, his title, or the truth about who he really was. But what she did know was enough for now. He had helped her mop the floor when he didn't have to, and in that simple act, he had shown her that even in the quietest corners of the world, kindness could shine as brightly as the polished boardroom table. The next morning, Maria returned to the building as usual. Her night shift had ended only a few hours earlier, and she was still tired, but her steps felt lighter than they normally did. As she walked through the glass doors with her small lunchbox in hand, she kept thinking about the stranger from the night before. The memory of him wiping down the table and carrying her mop bucket stayed fresh in her mind. She still didn't know who he was. In her head, she decided he must be new. Perhaps an assistant just starting in the company, or maybe an employee who had stayed behind after his first boardroom meeting. She smiled to herself, imagining how strange it must have looked, an office worker and a janitor mopping a boardroom together. Maria shook her head gently, amused by the memory, and pushed her cart down the hallway to begin her shift. She expected the day to pass like any other, quiet, ordinary, and unnoticed. But just before noon, as she passed through the lobby to empty a trash bag, she noticed something unusual. The atmosphere of the building had changed. People stood straighter, spoke in lower voices, and hurried about with more energy than usual. There was a buzz of excitement, as if something important was happening. Maria slowed her steps, glancing around. A group of employees had gathered near the entrance, whispering and adjusting their ties. Some carried folders, others held tablets, their eyes darting nervously toward the glass doors. "What's going on?" Maria quietly asked one of the security guards as she passed. The guard, looking unusually alert, replied, "The CEO is here today. He just got back from overseas. Big meeting in the boardroom." Maria nodded politely, though the words made her heart give a small jump. The CEO? She had heard of him, of course. Everyone had. His name was mentioned often in conversations between employees. He was the one who made the big decisions, the one who traveled across countries to expand the company, the one whose photo sometimes appeared in newspapers. But Maria had never seen him in person. People like him lived in a different world from people like her. She continued with her work, not thinking much more of it. Executives and meetings were not her concern. Her job was to keep the place clean, nothing more. Yet the excitement in the air stayed with her. By early afternoon, she wheeled her cart toward the boardroom again, careful not to disturb anyone. The doors were shut tightly, and she could hear the low murmur of voices inside. She knew better than to interrupt, so she busied herself in the hallway, dusting the glass wall and checking the bins nearby. It was then that the doors swung open. A line of people began to exit, men in suits, women in crisp dresses, all speaking quickly as they walked. Maria stepped back to let them pass, lowering her eyes as she always did. One after another, they moved out, carrying folders and tablets, their voices filled with energy. And then, at the end of the line, he appeared. Maria froze. Her mop nearly slipped from her hands. It was him. The man from last night. The one who had knelt on the floor beside her, who had carried her mop bucket and wiped the table with his own hands. He wasn't in a simple shirt now, he wore a perfectly tailored suit, his tie neat, his posture tall and confident. People around him moved with respect, stepping aside as if he carried invisible weight. They nodded, smiled, and greeted him with a mixture of admiration and nervousness. Maria's heart pounded. She stared, unable to believe her eyes. The new guy wasn't new at all. He wasn't an intern. He wasn't an assistant. He wasn't just another worker trying to prove himself. He was the CEO. The man who ran the entire company. The man whose name was spoken in every corner of the building. The leader everyone admired from afar but rarely saw up close. For a moment, Maria's thoughts tangled. She remembered how she had teased him for scrubbing the carpet too roughly. She remembered telling him about her children, about her plants, about her little balcony garden. She remembered laughing with him, treating him as though he were simply another worker like her. Heat rushed to her face. Had she been foolish? Had she spoken too casually? What if he had only been polite because he pitied her? But then, as he walked past her, something happened. He turned his head and saw her. and instead of looking away, instead of pretending not to know her, he smiled. It wasn't the polite, distant smile she often received from busy employees. It was warm, real, the same smile he had given her last night as they worked side by side. For a brief moment, his eyes met hers, and Maria felt the same sense of ease she had felt the night before. Her breath caught. She wanted to look away, but his smile steadied her. In that instant, she realized something important: he hadn't changed. The suit, the title, the respect from others, none of it had erased the kindness she had seen in him the night before. The CEO kept walking, surrounded by his team, his presence commanding the room. Maria stood frozen in the hallway, gripping the handle of her mop, her thoughts swirling. The rest of her shift passed in a blur. She worked as usual, cleaning quietly, but her mind kept returning to the reveal. The man she thought was the new guy was, in fact, the leader of the entire company. It was almost unbelievable. Yet it was true. Later that evening, as the building grew quiet again, Maria entered the boardroom once more. The meeting was over, and the room was filled with the usual signs of a long day: coffee rings, paper scraps, chairs out of place. She set her bucket down, still replaying the moment in her head. As she began to wipe the table, she imagined him sitting there at the head of it, commanding attention, guiding conversations, making choices that affected hundreds of lives. The same hands that had carried her mop bucket the night before were the ones that signed contracts and shaped futures. Maria felt a strange mix of emotions: surprise, embarrassment, awe, and something else she couldn't quite name. But beneath it all, there was also a quiet sense of comfort. Because she now knew something few others did: behind the polished suit and the important title, the CEO was still just a person. A person who wasn't afraid to roll up his sleeves, pick up a cloth, and mop a floor when no one was watching. As she polished the table, Maria smiled softly to herself. The memory of last night was no longer just amusing, it had become a reminder that the world held unexpected truths. People weren't always what they seemed. Sometimes the most powerful person in the building could also be the one who knelt beside you on the floor, scrubbing a stain without hesitation. Maria finished her work slowly, savoring the thought. She didn't know if she would ever speak to him again, not in the way they had spoken last night. Their worlds were too far apart. Yet she also knew that even if he never said another word to her, the memory of his kindness would stay with her forever. And perhaps, she thought as she pushed her cart down the hallway, he would remember too. Maybe when he walked into the boardroom the next time, dressed in his perfect suit, he would still recall the quiet night when he had mopped the floor beside a janitor who treated him not as a CEO, but simply as another human being. The days that followed returned to their normal rhythm, yet something had changed for Maria. She went about her nightly work as always, pushing her cart down long hallways, mopping the glossy floors, wiping desks that carried the traces of busy hands. But every time she entered the boardroom, her heart paused for a moment. She could still see the memory of that night when the so-called new guy helped her clean, his shirt sleeves rolled up, his smile warm and unguarded. Now she knew who he truly was. David Lawson, the name that echoed through the building whenever important news was announced, the leader who had grown the company from a small firm into an international business. For Maria, the name had always belonged to a figure distant and untouchable. Yet now, she carried a secret image of him, kneeling on the floor, cloth in hand, scrubbing beside her as if he were just another worker. She kept that memory close, almost like a small flame. It gave her comfort during her long shifts. The thought reminded her that even the highest person in the building had not been above helping with the simplest task. It told her that her work, often unnoticed, carried value, because someone important had chosen to share it with her. At first, Maria thought the moment would fade. She assumed the CEO would forget about her, swept away by meetings, travels, and responsibilities. She imagined he would return to his world of polished suits and glass offices, while she remained in her quiet corner, invisible as always. But she was wrong. The first sign came a few days later. Maria was emptying bins in one of the hallways when she heard footsteps approaching. She glanced up and saw him, David Lawson, walking with two managers at his side. They were deep in conversation, their words quick and serious. Maria lowered her eyes, as she always did when executives passed by. But then something unexpected happened. As he walked by, David slowed, glanced her way, and gave her that same warm smile he had shared in the boardroom. It lasted only a second, but it was enough. He acknowledged her, not as an invisible worker, but as a person worth noticing. The managers beside him looked slightly surprised, but David didn't seem to care. Maria felt her heart lift. That single smile meant more to her than words could explain. It told her that he remembered. That night wasn't forgotten, not even by him. In the weeks that followed, small moments like this repeated. Sometimes he greeted her with a simple good evening as he left late from the office. Sometimes he nodded in her direction while passing in the lobby. Each time, it was brief, yet it mattered deeply to Maria. For once, she felt visible. She didn't tell anyone about what had happened in the boardroom. It was her secret, a memory she treasured quietly. She didn't want to boast or draw attention. Besides, she knew people might not believe her. To them, the CEO was someone distant, far above everyday staff. The thought of him helping a janitor mop the floor would sound like a story made up to pass time. But Maria didn't need others to believe her. She believed it herself, and that was enough. Over time, she noticed something else. The night she had spent with David Lawson didn't just change her view of him, it also changed her view of herself. She no longer felt quite so invisible. She began to see her own work differently, realizing it held a quiet dignity that even the highest leader had recognized. She found herself standing a little taller, moving with a little more confidence. When she polished the glass walls until they sparkled, she thought, someone notices this, even if they don't say it. When she pushed the heavy bucket down the hallway, she reminded herself, I'm strong enough to do what many couldn't. And though she never expected praise or attention, the memory of that one night gave her strength to continue with a lighter heart. For David Lawson, the lesson was different but just as lasting. The night he had spent cleaning the boardroom reminded him of something he had almost forgotten: leadership wasn't about titles, power, or board meetings. It was about people. It was about humility. It was about recognizing the unseen hands that kept the company running quietly in the background. In his busy life, surrounded by numbers, reports, and deals, it was easy to forget the faces of those who worked when everyone else went home. But that night with Maria stayed with him. Each time he walked into the boardroom for a meeting, he remembered the feel of the cloth in his hand, the sound of the mop across the floor, and the quiet conversation with a woman who spoke of her children and her flowers with gentle pride. He began to greet more people in the building, not just executives, but also receptionists, guards, and cleaners. It was a small change, but it mattered. Slowly, others in the company noticed his example and followed it. The culture of the building began to shift, little by little, toward kindness and respect for every role. Maria never sought credit for that change, but deep down, she sensed she had been part of it. The night she had thought of as nothing more than shared cleaning had left ripples far beyond what she imagined. One evening, months later, Maria once again found herself in the boardroom after a long meeting. The table was messy, papers scattered, coffee stains marking the surface. As she began her usual work, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned and saw David Lawson standing at the door, his suit jacket draped over his arm. Their eyes met, and he smiled. "Looks like they left you another challenge," he said lightly. Maria chuckled softly. "They always do." For a moment, they stood there, the memory of their first encounter hanging quietly between them. Then David stepped forward, took off his jacket, and rolled up his sleeves. Maria shook her head with a laugh. "Not again," she said. But he only grinned. "Old habits," he replied, picking up a cloth from her cart. And once again, they worked side by side. The CEO and the janitor, not bound by titles or roles, but simply two people sharing a task. The world outside might have seen it as unusual, even unbelievable, but to Maria it felt natural now. And to David, it was a reminder of the kind of leader he wanted to remain, one who never forgot where dignity truly lay. As the room grew clean and the lights reflected off the polished table, Maria realized something. Life had given her a rare gift, the knowledge that kindness could bridge even the widest distance between people. She didn't need recognition, and she didn't crave attention. What she carried instead was a quiet truth: her work mattered, and so did she. And for David Lawson, the lesson was just as clear. Leadership without humility was empty. But leadership with respect even for the quietest worker in the building was what truly gave meaning to his role. In the end, their worlds remained different. Maria still pushed her cart through quiet hallways at night, and David still traveled across countries making decisions that shaped the future of the company. Yet whenever their paths crossed, they exchanged that same warm smile, a silent acknowledgement of the night they had mopped the floor together. It was a simple story, one that might sound small compared to the grand things that happened in the company. But for Maria, it was enough to know that she had been seen, respected, and remembered. And for David, it was enough to remind him that true greatness often revealed itself not in boardrooms, but in the quiet moments when people treated each other with kindness, no matter their title. And so, the lesson lingered for both of them, and perhaps for everyone who heard whispers of it later: dignity has no uniform, kindness has no rank, and respect belongs to all.